Okay, back to work. We left off here. The U.S. government, U.S. military understood, as Native Americans well understood, that the buffalo was sort of a key resource and a key part of what was increasingly becoming a military conflict between the two sides. General Philip Sheridan, who was one of the leading generals dealing with the West, or a leading general who did deal with the West, a major Civil War hero on the Northern Union side, said they are destroying the Indians' commissary, a comment he made noting that his own troops and white settlers and hunters killing the buffalo are killing their food source. Commissary is a place where you go to sort of get a meal, a cafe. It's like the cafeteria for military in a sense. So basically, he's saying this is helping us to defeat Native Americans. The famous Comanche chief Quanah Parker actually defied U.S. authorities, and, trying to keep him and his group of. He didn't command all the Comanche, one particular group, but he defied them, didn't stay on the reservation, and led attacks on white hunters as well as U.S. cavalry, because he certainly understood what was at stake here, that the buffalo was already dwindling in numbers, and it looked as though whites and the U.S. government was deliberately trying to drive it into extinction to exhaust their major food source, making economic warfare on them. Scholars estimate that between 1870 and 75, 5-year period, 5 or 6 million buffalo died just on the southern plain alone. I don't know if we have numbers for further to the north. The Sioux, well known partly because of a book that bears his name today, religious leader Black Elk said the last of the bison herds was slaughtered by the Wasatchews, the Sioux name for white folk, in 1883 when he was just 20 years old. So something that was seared into his memory for the rest of his life. The destruction, to some degree deliberate, of the buffalo by Americans. I mean, white Americans. The Bozeman Trail. This was part of the opening up of the resources in the West. Industrial capitalism coming to the West. So we'll get to the railroads shortly. But railroads, gold mines, coal mines, all these things that are tapped into by Americans, streaming to the West, not just individuals, but companies, businesses, corporations as well. And one of the major projects here was the building of the Bozeman Trail, which turned out to be just one of many encroachments of Native American land and encroachments on their way of life. Once again, a gold discovery caused an influx of settlers to this part of the country, Wyoming, Montana area. Native American lands then once again were under pressure. Professor Rourke says in 1866, just after the Civil War, the Cheyenne united with the Sioux in Wyoming to protect their hunting grounds, which were threatened by the construction of the Bozeman Trail, connecting Fort Laramie with the goldfields in Montana. So Fort Laramie, a government outpost, was now to be connected with the goldfields. So that tells you right there why the road was being built in the first place. But Native Americans did not like it, and this became a major, one of many, but a major bone of contention between the two. William Tecumseh Sherman, after the Civil War, was reassigned by the U.S. military and became the highest-ranking leader in the West. Sherman, like Sheridan, who I already mentioned, was also a Civil War hero. In fact, Sherman was Sheridan's boss and still was at this point as well. But both of them were gifted generals and are major reasons for the Northern American victory over the Confederacy in the Civil War. But they both could be pretty brutal in fighting, and they do show it here in the West as they did in the Civil War. The original U.S. policy, meaning right at the outset of this period, was to, as Sheridan said, these are his own words, to remove all Native Americans to a safe place and then reduce them to a helpless condition. This meant we've got to get them all under reservations and then kind of make them passive. So it's harsh sounding, and it is, but keep in mind he was hoping, although it might have been unrealistic, that this would be a peaceful solution. However humiliating and degrading to Native Americans, it wouldn't be a bloody solution if they went along with it. But that's the part that was probably far-fetched. So he's the general in charge, at least in the earliest years of these conflicts with Native Americans on the Great Plains, largely. At one point he said, in this time period, I will not permit them, Native Americans, to be warred against as long as they are not banded together in parties large enough to carry on war. Well, that sounds nice enough, sort of. We'll come back to that. But he sounds sort of more openly harsh, as an understatement, when he says in a letter to Sheridan, go ahead in your own way, and I will back you with my whole authority. If it results in the utter annihilation of the Indians, it is but the result of what they have been warned of again and again. I will say nothing and do nothing to restrain our troops from doing what they deem proper on the spot. So he's telling Sheridan, do whatever you need to do. I'll look the other way. I got your back, even if it means annihilation. Those are Sherman's own word. That's his word, annihilation. So even if you annihilate them, I'll back you. I'll support you as your boss. I've got you covered. So I mean, you don't get much harsher than annihilation. I will go back to the previous quote. Even that's misleadingly hardcore, because he's saying, I won't permit Native Americans to be harmed and have violence perpetrated against them as long as they're not banded together in parties large enough to carry on war. But he already knew that they were banded together in parties that were large enough to carry on war. So he was basically saying, as long as they're not who they are, they're safe. But they are who they are. They're not organized this way, but they are organized that way. So Tecumseh Sherman, I'm sure he believed that he used kind of a somewhat moderate approach to Native Americans, but certainly Native Americans didn't feel that way, and many scholars don't to this day. The Fort Laramie Treaty, the second one, we already dealt with the first one, this one coming about 17 years after the first, of 1868. The second one saw actually Sherman, who's in that tent there in that photograph, negotiate with the Sioux chief Red Cloud, one of the major Native American leaders on the plains. And Red Cloud had earlier been a much more oppositional figure, putting up a great deal of resistance to American encroachment on Native American lands, and getting in the way of their way of life. But he had come to believe that they didn't really have a choice. They needed to compromise and sort of get something out of a deal if they could. Back to Rourke again, a guy named Captain William Fetterman, who had boasted that with 80 men he could ride through the Sioux Nation, was killed along with all of his troops in an Indian attack. The Sioux' impressive victories, there were others as well as that one, led to the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, in which the U.S. agreed to abandon the Bozeman Trail and guarantee the Indians control of the Black Hills, land sacred to the Lakota Sioux. So an agreement that looked like it was in many ways favorable to Native Americans. Right, the Bozeman Trail would be given up on, and the Black Hills would be recognized as sacred for Native Americans. But Rourke goes on to say, the treaty was full of contradictions. In one breath promising to preserve Indian land, and in the next forcing the tribes to relinquish all territory outside the reservations. Red Cloud, who did negotiate this treaty, was sorry after the fact because, as usual, the U.S. government didn't really make good on their responsibilities, their end of the treaty. So he said at one point, think of it. I, who used to own country so extensive that I could not ride through it in a single week, must now tell Washington when I'm hungry. I must beg for that which I own. So he was bitter about it after the fact. But beforehand, he was counseling practicality and a certain pragmatism. And it was pragmatic. He understood that continuing to make warfare against the U.S. in the long run would be a losing set of battles. Why? Because there's just way too much firepower and money on the economic side behind a war. Population size, was on the side of white Americans and the U.S. government, so they don't have a chance. They're going to lose. What's the point of fighting if we're destined to lose? So the pragmatic move from Red Cloud's point of view was to make a deal. However, the more famous leaders at the same time, Sioux leaders Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, were dead set opposed to making this deal that Red Cloud did sign and went into effect. So they resisted it. They thought the honorable thing to do was not make a deal and fight to defend their rights, their lands, their way of life. The honorable thing to do is resist by force. It's possible they were both right. Question, of course, is right there. But you see the dilemma. This is a problem, and no surprise. It should be no surprise that there was this debate over, what we should do, and that these would be the two big, possible solutions: make a deal, get something out of it, go quietly, or go down swinging. Crazy Horse, a noted, gifted warrior, he supposedly said, "It's a great day to fight. It's a great day to die." But we don't know if he said that, but he did say the above. I want no part of the piecemeal penning of my people, right? Meaning I don't want any part of my people being penned in, right? We're a group of people that, especially since we've been a horse culture, are used to moving around and sort of wide open spaces over a lot of territory, and I don't want any part of us being penned up. So the Fort Laramie Treaty and its aftermath helped to kind of create a certain split between certain Native American groups. But as I said in the last slide, or when looking at the last slide, even Red Cloud was sorry that he had signed the treaty, at least to some degree, after the fact. So this brought on the Indian Wars that we could say lasted for about 30 years, the years you see here, twice. And Native Americans here make one last bid for independence, or at least autonomy, and their own way of life. Autonomy is not quite independence, but means you're pretty much left alone to do as you please. So we're not going to cover all aspects of the wars, and we're not going to dwell on this for very long, again, for reasons of time. But we'll deal with a little bit of it. The Comanche Campaign in the 1870s. The once great Comanche Empire, you can see sort of circled in red on the map, which was pretty extensive. It actually went beyond that even, from Canada to Mexico, so it goes north of the red line on the top there, built on the trade of guns, horses, hides, and captives, in a sense slaves, was now down to several thousand people. The Comanche at one time were feared by everybody. They were feared by Mexico and the Spanish. They were feared by white Americans. They were feared by other European countries, not mentioned other Native American groups, because they were extremely skilled horsemen and extremely skilled fighters. Going to war with the Comanche was something that basically everybody feared. But by this time they had been depleted in number and so in power, but they're still holding on, partially through pride to their own way of life and an independence, outside of what the United States government wants them to do. And they still had enough power to and skill to violently raid settlers, white settlers' farms in Texas successfully. So they're doing it over and over again. Eventually, General Sherman dispatched 3,000 U.S. troops to the area in 1871. He used the same tactics that he had used, strategy and tactics that he had used in the Civil War in his famous March to the Sea in the state of Georgia and then into the Carolinas afterwards. Making Georgia howl, as it was said. What Sherman did in that war was just steamroll the state of Georgia, not just defeat Confederate troops on the battlefield, but tear down their, burn down their crops, burn down their towns and cities, tear up their crops, tear down their telegraph lines, pull up their railroad lines, just wreak utter havoc, and in a sense terrorize the place and make it impossible, or as much as possible, to continue the war because you've destroyed everything in your wake. So it's like he was like, in his army was like a hurricane or tornado, one big tornado going through Georgia. So he basically used the same techniques here. So he didn't necessarily attack Native American warrior groups, Comanche warrior groups, head on. He'd kind of go around them and find their campsites, find their homes, and go into those and just destroy everything, so they wouldn't be able to eat. And sure enough, after months of doing this, with little left to survive on, the remaining Comanche reluctantly agreed to live on reservation land. A quite sad ending to a very proud history. Quanah Parker, again, had a white mother, a Native American father, hence the name, although I'm not exactly sure how that came about. I don't mean the marriage, but the name part of it. But the might be a matrilineal thing. I forget about the Comanche, to be honest with you. But the Comanche, again, had been formidable for a long, long time. That doesn't mean they were necessarily nice, by the way. There is a tendency, even today, for us to think of Native Americans as largely peaceful and sort of kind and considerate to each other, to others, to the environment, which is true in some tribes, in some ways, and certainly Native Europeans did much more damage to the environment, and their warfare was on a larger scale. One could say more violent there as well. Nonetheless, it's part of the sort of mythology and romanticism of Native Americans that all Native American groups were peaceful. I actually think it does a disservice to Native Americans to not point that out. It's almost like you're saying, well, they couldn't fight. Yes, they could, and they were formidable opponents, the Comanche and some other groups. So to me, to sort of say that all Native Americans were peaceful all the time is underestimating their abilities and their ability to defend themselves and stand up for themselves. And the Comanche did that in a big way. So this is a very tragic ending to a very proud people's way of life. Also tragic is the Nez Perce War of 1877. Maybe this is the most sort of heartrending of all of the episodes during this period. In 1863, also in the middle of the Civil War, the U.S. dictated a treaty. Dictated means they just said, here it is, take it or leave it, or take it or take it, that took most Nez Perce land. They took so much of their land and gave them just enough, for a small reservation, that most leaders chiefs refused to move onto the reservation. And this sort of went on and on until in 1877, the U.S. Army issued an ultimatum: come into the reservation or be tracked down and killed or brought back to the reservation. Approximately 800 Nez Perce, not all of them, but one particular group under the leadership of this guy, Chief Joseph, became famous because of these events, trekked 1,300 miles approximately through Idaho, Wyoming, on Montana to try to get to Canada. He had to fight the whole way because the U.S. military, at least a military unit under the command of Oliver O. Howard, another Civil War general on the Union side, who sort of tracked him and followed him the whole way. They had to kind of fight it out and lost a lot of their party. Not just the battle, the conditions of cold and the privations of being kind of on the run out in the wilderness, but 50 miles from Canada, almost there. If you look at the map on the right, you can see this sort of twisted, turning, long, jaunt, and they're almost there and didn't quite make it. After a 5-day siege where they were sort of trapped, Chief Joseph surrendered. In his reported speech, he's renowned to have said, these are famous words now, especially the last part of it, I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. It is cold, and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. So to me, this has always been the saddest of many sad stories during this period for Native Americans. I'm not sure why, but I thought maybe it's because they were so close to getting to freedom. So this so far, and it will continue, sadly, certainly comes across to us as unbelievably cruel to do to anyone, and it's true. Sadly, we have to deal with the ugly truths in our history if we're to understand our history and our world today. The Sioux War of 1876, 1877, right around the same time. The Sioux, by this time, were really kind of the premier Native American group, at least in the plains, maybe in the whole country, in terms of their power, prestige, their ability to sway other Native American groups. One Sioux leader saying around this time, wherever we went, the soldiers came to kill us. And because the U.S. government and military figured out, didn't take them a great deal of doing, that the Sioux were kind of the leaders. If we can subdue the Sioux, get them to go to reservations, or force them through military enterprise, military columns that we send out, either way, then it'll be a large step to pacifying Native Americans in that region, period. In 1874, this is becoming a recognizable pattern for us now. Gold was discovered in the Black Hills of the Dakotas, which led the U.S. government to violate its deal with Red Cloud. And miners and settlers came streaming into the area, as always happen when there's a gold or whatever strike, and it puts extra pressure on Native American lands. And there's all kinds of strains, they're already there, but now, even more tense between Native Americans and whites. In 1876, the U.S. Army launched a three-pronged attack in sort of three groups, sort of three fronts in a sense. One under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. More on him momentarily. One under the command of General George Crook, and another under the leadership of Colonel John Gibbon. Crazy Horse and his warriors stopped Crook's column at the Battle of Rosebud. So there's a Native American victory there, a pretty serious one. Custer famously divided his troops in order to attack, which failed miserably. Again, more on that in a minute. But after this campaign, which, as we'll see, was not entirely successful, the Native Americans who had sort of amassed the Sioux and their allied tribes, and a lot of sort of subgroups in those tribes. Remember, a lot of these people moved around nomadically still. They're gatherer types, although they're mainly herder types, more or less. But they oftentimes broke into small groups and only came together under certain circumstances. We've seen that, right? As early as our first unit, thousands of years ago. Archaic peoples, prehistoric peoples are already, often doing that. So after the victory over Custer and Crook at Rosebud, the Native Americans kind of disbanded and sort of split up. But the U.S. government just continued to send units to hunt down this smaller group, that smaller group, until they'd basically been all subdued, or at least enough of them to end any threat. In 1877, Crazy Horse was captured and killed. In 1881, Sitting Bull surrendered. And he now didn't want any part of it because he realized it was there was just no way that they were going to win. He was tragically murdered on the Standing Rock Reservation in the Black Hills when U.S. forces were sent to arrest him in the middle of the night. And when people and cabins around him heard the commotion and saw that it was Sitting Bull, everybody came outside. By this time, he was the most famous Native American in America, and arguably the most powerful leader in all of Native America, not just in the Sioux tribe. And he went on to be famous, kind of martyred after his death. But it's not entirely clear why. But somebody pulled out one of the U.S. Soldiers pulled out a gun and shot him, just kind of at point blank range. It was a tense situation, I believe. But why he shot him is I think unclear. To make it even more confusing, it was a Native American scout that was in the employ of the U.S. government that actually pulled the trigger. There are a number of Native American scouts with that force sent out to arrest him, as tended to be the case. It made sense that there be at least one person in any U.S. military unit that was, Native American background, who could sort of give them advice, interpret, depending on the language, etc. So it ended up being Native American police working for the U.S. military that actually shot Sitting Bull. That doesn't take the responsibility away from the U.S. government or military, but it does confuse things, complicate them a bit. George Armstrong Custer. This guy was a piece of work. That's putting it mildly. So it was at the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand, which kind of gives away the ending, if you didn't already know. That's Custer, before the battle started, made the disastrous decision of splitting his regiment into two pieces, and pushed them so far apart, it's a cavalry unit, that the other unit couldn't come back in time to sort of assist. They weren't in enough proximity to come to each other's kind of support. Custer showed all signs of rushing this part of the three-pronged campaign, his part. And it seems, we're not entirely sure of this, but it seems like in part it was because he was already thinking about a political career. He'd been a young, dashing cavalry officer in the Civil War on the Union side. You can't really see it in the black and white picture, so with the hat on, but he had these sort of long locks of blonde hair. So the Native Americans called him Yellow Hair for that reason. But he was kind of this dashing, kind of swashbuckling figure, and he had lots of kind of charm and lots of ambition. He wanted to be a politician, congressman, maybe even president. And so his military record, which is pretty good from the Civil War, his theatrical good looks, he loved publicity and he knew how to court it. And there weren't cameras in those days, but if there were cameras, he would have been searching out the cameras and not shy about getting in front of them at all. So he did turn himself into a press favorite. So the press basically went along with it, and it appears that he wanted one more military victory because he was young and a junior officer in the American Civil War. Now he's sort of a higher ranking officer, colonel, and given more responsibility. And these battles and wars were getting quite a bit of press anyway. So it appears that he did this in part, was willing to do this in part, because he wanted to get the notoriety, wanted to become a military hero. He already was a little bit, but he felt like I need a little bit more on my resume on the military side to promote my political career. So this dashing colonel, as one source said, commanded the nation's attention. But he appears to have kind of skipped important preparations like planning and scouting the enemy. In the final battle, if you can even call it that, he had 225 cavalry soldiers with him, with a force of about 8,000 Sioux and other allies surrounding them. And everybody was cut down, including Yellow Hair himself. Custer's last stand was Custer's last stand. So Sioux leaders actually were impressed with the courage that he and his soldiers showed. He said one of them said they kept in order and fought like brave warriors as long as they had a man left. But there was nowhere for Custer to hide. He didn't, but even if he wanted to, since he was famous and could be easily seen on the battlefield with a officer's uniform and long, sort of blonde hair, this is flashy, dashing figure. But Custer just cut corners here, didn't plan, made bad decisions, not scouting the enemy. That's probably partly racism, by the way, too. Just assuming I'm an American officer, and we're smarter, and we've got guns, and they had guns too, but we we know how to use modern weaponry better. My force can do sort of whatever it wants. So underestimating Native Americans, partly because of racism, is a partial explanation of how and why he got himself into such a impossible situation. But all this did, in a way, was just get Americans more and more angry at Native Americans. Whether that is rational or not doesn't matter. They tended to. Again, there were some Americans still that were sympathetic to Native American issues and their attempts to protect their land, protect their way of life, their culture, etc. But Custer's last stand was kind of like a remember the Alamo moment for many Americans. Another way to try to deal with the Indian question, in this case a peaceful way, but still awfully unpleasant to our eyes and ears today, were Indian schools that were set up. And they were really set up as part of a war against Indian culture, kind of a soft war as opposed to a hard, violent war. And as Robert Hines says in a fairly recent book on the West called Frontiers, this was an unprecedented federal assault on Indian autonomy. Basically means freedom. Federal Indian agents were directed to undertake a sustained campaign of forced cultural modification, outlawing Indian customs they considered, quote, savage and barbarous, unquote. Cultural imperialism was notable in the curriculum of reservation schools. Quote, if Indian children are to be civilized, they must learn the language of civilization, ruled the Interior Secretary of the U.S., Secretary of the Interior. Again, that word civilized implying that they're not civilized. If they can be civilized, if you're saying someone can become civilized, you're saying they're not civilized now. So the same kind of racism, elitism, feelings of superiority of white Americans over Native American children in this case, but Native Americans as a whole. He goes on to say, even more severe were practices in Indian boarding schools, the one you see here on the left, most famously Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. There we are. The girls were given Euro-American names, dressed as Victorian ladies, and taught to play the piano. The boys were organized into military companies and drilled in uniforms. These schools have come under an increasing amount of fire by scholars in recent years, recent decades, but increasingly so. And you can see why. Right? This is an attempt to just force Native Americans to give up their way of life, their customs, their culture, and so forth. The Dawes Act comes right around this time as well, just as the wars were dying down. U.S. military having won them and caused Sitting Bull, Quanah Parker, others to basically finally go quietly. The Dawes Act is passed. Dawes, the name of the congressman who basically sponsored the bill. H.W. Brands in Dreams of El Dorado, a very recent book on history of the West, says the question of autonomy or assimilation persisted, meaning are Native Americans going to be able to stay autonomous within the U.S., basically practice their own way of life, or they're going to be forced to assimilate and become good little white capitalist, individual property-owning Americans. Many Indians assimilated informally by expedient of leaving their reservations and living in the larger non-Indian community. This was seldom easy, but it was least problematic for Indians who married whites or were children of such unions. Assimilation was the goal of missionaries to the Indians. These two people actually became famous. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, husband and wife, sought to teach the Indians not merely the religion of the whites, but the way of living of the whites. So the lifestyle as well as the religion, Christianity. Americans of the 19th century almost unanimously considered farming superior as a way of life to hunting and gathering. If the Indians would just settle down and become farmers, the missionaries and other reformers said they might enjoy the blessings all Americans enjoyed. I have no doubt that Marcus and Narcissa Whitman and others like them were sincerely trying to help. However, grossly misguided, at the very least, that appears to us today. In their own minds, they believe they were helping. It's not uncommon, right, even in our own day, for someone to think that they're helping when they're actually not helping or actually hurting. Brands goes on to say, such was the philosophy behind the Dawes Severalty Act, 1887. Supporters of the law concluded that the reservation system wasn't working. Reservation Indians had little incentive or opportunity to better their lot. The key to improvement, the law supporters said, was individual ownership. They're trying to inject an element of incentive here, because the reservations were legally granted to the tribe, not legally granted to individual families or individual persons. So the tribe owned the land on a reservation before this. The Dawes Act changed that and now parceled the land out in sort of pieces, 160 acres, 40 for each child. And so the idea is, okay, with the community structure of this, they're just sort of waiting for government, supplies to come in, and they're not lifting a finger to sort of improve themselves. And so if we make them all landowners, they own their own small piece of land on the larger reservation now, or what used to be the reservation, they're more likely to make an effort and work to assimilate as successful members of American society. It's an interesting idea. It's just that it's being forced on a people that largely doesn't want this, and they don't get a say in whether they are going to do this or not. They're forced into it. It was passed as law. The reservations were broken up. Oh, and by the way, which makes much of the rationale for doing this, at least what I've given you so far, questionable. Once they divided into 160-acre or larger parcels and gave land to each Native American person or family, guess what? There was a lot of reservation land left over. What did the U.S. do there? Well, they sold that off to white settlers. So this also looks like a land grab and a way to rip off Native Americans, yet again. A real sign that Native Americans were kind of at their wits' end is the ghost dance religion, which spread like wildfire across the U.S. In the latter part of the 19th century. To me, the ghost dance and how popular it became as quickly as it did shows signs of desperation. It says of a people, but I kind of mean Native Americans in general as a people. A Native American leader in Nevada named Wovoka, also had an American or anglicized name, Jack Wilson, was preaching a new religion, and word just kind of spread by word of mouth. And people started to come and visit him. Chiefs and leaders from one tribe and another came all the way to Nevada to listen to him preach, listen to what he had to say. And the religion put forward the notion, theology, that if Native Americans did certain ceremonial dances and rituals and sort of did them the right way, in time their dead relatives that were killed by whites would return to life. The buffalo would come back to the plains. It had basically been sent into extinction. The whites would disappear and wouldn't bother us or try to take our land any longer. And this was, of course, a fantastic thing to believe. And yet it spread, as I said, like wildfire across the plains, and people were doing the ghost dance on reservation after reservation. Why? It seems, what? We're going to dance around and do tribal rituals, and it's going to make the whites go away and our dead relatives come back? Pretty far-fetched. But again, that's why I think you can see desperation in this. The ghost dance got to Standing Rock Reservation, the Black Hills, where Sitting Bull lived on reservation territory. He witnessed it firsthand. He did, I think, approve of it, but I'm not sure he believed in it. I think it's probably more likely that Sitting Bull recognized that it was giving his people a certain sense of hope to a people that really had no other hope, tragically. So he's saying, okay, what's so wrong with, much as it's not true. He didn't tell them that this stuff's going to happen. That all the buffalo will come back if you just practice these rituals of the ghost dance religion. If it makes them feel good for a while, then let it go. Let them do it. So this is also another heart-wrenching sort of element to what in many ways was sort of the dying off of autonomy, not of dying off of Native American culture, but dying off of autonomy for Native American peoples and cultures. So the religion was so popular because it was something people wanted to believe. Right? And I don't blame them, given the bleak situation facing them, that they would grasp onto this as kind of a last straw. The Native Americans practicing this religion were doing so for the reasons just mentioned. This was spiritual, religious, psychological. It wasn't military. But because the dancing involved quite a bit of a frantic movement, American agents, every reservation had an American agent that worked for the federal government, they misinterpreted this and saw it as a sign of hostility, and they thought there was going to be a violent rebellion on the other side of it. One famous cable sent to Washington, D.C., back to the government by an agent, said the Indians are dancing in the snow and are wild and crazy, and went on to say, we need help, we need to send troops. And so the government believed this, that the ghost dance was dangerous, again, misinterpreting it entirely, and they then sought to crack down on it, and indeed did. This led in part to the back bookend that I mentioned before of Native American massacres. We talked about the Sand Creek Massacre just near the end of the Civil War, near the beginning of the Gilded Age, and now closer to the end of the Gilded Age, the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. As Black Elk, in a famous book called Black Elk Speaks, a medicine man, holy man in the Sioux tribe, said a people's dream died that day at Wounded Knee. And many historians have kind of seen this as the last gasp of autonomy for Native Americans as a whole, not just the Sioux. This was kind of the end of a long-term struggle going back centuries for Native Americans to defend their culture, their way of life, their land. A group of Sioux left the reservation, I forget which one it was, in 1890 to practice the ghost dance religion on their own. So they went out into kind of the wilderness to practice, probably partially because they were getting, pushback from authorities, U.S. authorities in the reservation land. The U.S. government sent out elements of the 7th Cavalry, ironically Custer's old unit. Custer's long gone by now, to intercept them and bring them back. When the two groups met, the American commander in charge found them. He had his troops and the Native Americans sort of bed down for the night. And he had his troops sort of surround the Native Americans at nighttime. He had Native American scouts with him, as I told you was sort of the norm. And he was going to try to disarm the Native Americans before he took them back to the reservation, or escorted them kind of under armed guard back to the reservation. And the scouts told him not to do it, at least not that day, because it would cause a commotion and might cause, violence. But the next morning, though he listened to them that night and they bedded down sort of peacefully, kind of surrounding Native Americans, in the morning, he had his troops start to round up weapons in the Native Americans' makeshift camp. And it got Native Americans, antsy and anxious, and they started to, get more agitated and sort of hostile in return. And it's one of those things that happens all too often in history. A shot rang out. We don't know from where, what side, but from that, U.S. troops just started opening fire. And maybe many of them thinking that they were supposed to now. Who knows why? But in a matter of minutes, 200 Native Americans were killed and wounded. Once again, many of them women and children. Some who tried to sort of run away through ravines and gullies were actually chased down in some cases and shot and killed as they're trying to get away. So this was a gruesome massacre, crime. This wasn't a battle. Sometimes at the time it was referred to as a battle in newspapers and journals, but it's pretty clear to think that it was a massacre. A frontier of enterprise, big business in the American West during the Gilded Age. Quoting Hines' book again, the West would become a vast resource windfall for industrial America, supplying bread and meat, lumber, and minerals. I like to emphasize, and I already said this in the introductory part of this unit a little while ago, that we tend not to, I think, associate the American West with the things going on the East Coast, like the rise of industrial firms, steel and oil and oil refining, steel production, railroads, at least in an industrial capacity. But nonetheless, capitalism was everywhere in the West, and big corporations were all over. It wasn't just cowboys coming out. It was corporations coming out and putting down an investment stake or economic stake in what they saw as the West's bright economic future. And they were right, of course. Our first stop is California, and a look at the Big Four, as they were known, partly because they were big dudes, but they've been known as the Big Four ever since. Clockwise from the upper right, Leland Stanford has a little college named after him today in Palo Alto. Collis P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. They were businessmen who didn't even know each other that well at first until they invested in this railroad project, who were basically merchants in Sacramento. And only later kind of relocated to the Bay Area, built big mansions and homes there. Hines says in that same passage, the railroads would bring to the West the best and the worst of Gilded Age America. You can even see that in the Big Four here. Each man hailed from modest roots in the Northeast. So they all came from the East Coast, and each would later proclaim the importance of Puritan virtues like diligence and thrift. But as Charles Crocker once admitted, luck had a hell of a lot to do with it, as did their willingness to play hard and fast with the rules when necessary. So these guys were certainly gifted entrepreneurs, and their ambition, their smarts, their work ethic, their drive, their ingenuity helps explain their success. But also, as Crocker even admitted, luck did, and so did kind of bending the rules when it benefited them. Hard-headed Crocker supervised the construction of the became known as the Central Pacific Railroad. They became the major investors and owners of the Central Pacific. So Crocker supervised the construction. Hopkins kept the books, finances. Huntington bid for supplies in the East, and Stanford worked the state legislature and the halls of Congress to get the politicians to support them, favor them, and fund them. So much of this was paid for through the railroad bill that went through Congress near the beginning of the American Civil War, which went through and President Lincoln signed it into law. One of the things that these guys did that was smart was capitalize on the timing. Since America was at war, they could sell this project as necessary and useful for future wars, because if you have a transcontinental rail line, which means a line all the way across the country, you can get not only goods but troops to and from, back and forth across the country much more quickly than you otherwise would have. So it's these guys that built the western portion. I want to say half, but it was less than half of the first transcontinental line. A company called the Union Pacific, which started in Omaha, Nebraska, which is kind of the end of where the railroads went overall in the Midwest and East Coast. And the Union Pacific started to build west, the Central Pacific east, and they coordinated as they went so that they could meet up and come together as one railroad. So the Central Pacific, these guys, the Big Four, starting in Sacramento and going through the foothills and the Sierras and beyond, slow, painstaking, difficult work for everybody involved, especially those that are doing the physical labor. But I said a moment ago that they covered less territory than the Union Pacific, and yet they had a harder job. Yes, they covered less territory because they had like granite to get through. They had to blast through the sides of or through the middle of mountains to make tunnels around the sides of them to build grades for the railroad to go. The Union Pacific was pretty much going across the plains on flat land, so they could lay down much more track per day, per week than the Central Pacific, owned by these guys, the Big Four, because of the different environmental conditions and terrain that they faced with. They were not above cooking the books to their advantage, to make sure the government paid for more and more in this. The railroad bill went through, as I said, but with the U.S. government giving these guys a huge gift, set of gifts. Not only did they pay for much of the construction, they gave the Big Four, or the Central Pacific, the railroad they own, huge chunks of territory along the route of track that they're laying. So these guys become major, very wealthy capitalists, not just for California, but they're wealthy across the board. The Gilded Age capitalists are famous for their successful entrepreneurship and organizational prowess in capitalist enterprise during this boom in industrial capitalism in the country. And these guys are right up there with John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, etc. Not quite as rich, but they're in the ballpark. So this was an engineering, technological, organizational feat of great impressiveness. H.W. Brands says the construction of the Pacific Railway was the grandest project of its kind in American history until then. It was certainly the greatest thing the West had ever seen. Mountain passes were higher than those on any railroad in America. The approaches to the passes were forbiddingly steep. They had to build these sort of huge trestles, again, blast through granite mountains, and so on. The primary workforce was the Chinese. It didn't start that way, but the Big Four, the Central Pacific, eventually saw the wisdom in hiring mostly Chinese workers to build the Central Pacific. Mostly because they could pay them less, as immigrants, new immigrants, usually desperate for jobs and wanting to sort of make as much as they could out of their time in America if they weren't planning to stay permanently. They were willing to work for less. Labor costs are always a consideration in capitalist endeavor. But the Chinese in general weren't exactly welcomed in California and on the West Coast. So there was racism and nativism from the beginning, which persisted. Horace Greeley, the famous and powerful editor of the New York Tribune, said the Chinese were, quote, uncivilized, unclean, and filthy beyond all conception, without any of the higher domestic or social relations. So that's pretty much dripping with resentment against them, but racism, prejudice. About 12,000 Chinese workers, 90% of all the workers, played a major role in building the Central Pacific. So 90% of the Central Pacific's workforce in building at least that railroad, the western part of the first transcontinental line, was Chinese labor. By 1870, after the project was just finished, more than 63,000 Chinese lived in the U.S., 77% of them in California. But again, they weren't welcomed by all Americans or Californians. And I'm not saying everybody, every white Californian was a nativist. That's not true either. But a pretty large chunk, or either suspicious or downright hostile to the Chinese presence, partly because they feared taking jobs and wages being lowered, etc. In San Francisco, Dennis Kearney, our textbook Rook tells us, Dennis Kearney was the leader of the Working Man's Party, harangued the Big Four, and at the same time called for discharging all Chinese workers. So they're angry at the Big Four for hiring Chinese workers because they believe it's harming California workers. 3 days of anti-Chinese riots in the Bay Area followed, which isn't very well known, but it's true. Anti-immigrant slogans popped up, the most famous one being "The Chinese must go." Not too subtle there. The Chinese must go. And sure enough, the U.S. Congress, all the way across the continent in Washington, D.C. in 1882, passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of that year, stopping immigration for all persons of the Chinese race, as it said in the bill, for 10 years. So the U.S. Congress is responding to nativism by adhering to it, by agreeing to it, or agreeing with it even. So there was a nativist backlash against the Chinese, as there were against a lot of ethnic and racial groups coming into the U.S. During this period and after. Chinese labor on the railroads itself. Brands, in one passage, talks about the Chinese expertise, oftentimes pre-existing. Some of them already had the expertise with using dynamite and black powder. With reeds brought from the Sacramento Delta, the Chinese wove baskets large enough to hold a man. They ran ropes through the eyelets at the tops of the baskets to hoist the anchor at the crest of the Cape Horn Cliff. By now, the Chinese crews were facile in the use of black powder, a Chinese invention, some of them pointed out. And the best of the blasters were lowered in baskets to the line of the railroad, or the roadbed, where they drilled holes in the rock, tamped in the powder, lit the fuses, and signaled to be pulled away before the charges ignited. In time, the work assumed a regular tempo till hundreds of barrels of black powder were going up in flame, concussion, and smoke. The canyon echoed with the roar of the blasts, followed by the rumble of the freed rock as it disappeared into the depths of the gorge below. I don't think I have to tell you that's extremely dangerous work, and I don't know what the number of deaths were, but there were deaths in this work. Charles Crocker, the member of the Big Four, owner of the company that supervised the work, said at one point it would be impossible to continue work without them, meaning the Chinese workers. He understood their value, even though he didn't necessarily show it, and how well he paid them. Because in the middle of winter, you see this kind of depicted in the drawing on the painting in the lower right, the Chinese went on strike for better conditions, better wages, and the Big Four, to show you that as capitalists, successful capitalists can often be when it comes to things relating to their business, ruthlessness reared its ugly head here. And they just agreed. The Chinese workers don't have a leg to stand on. It's the middle of winter. We're in the middle of the mountains. Where are they going to go to get food? If we cut off their food and their pay, they're going to starve. And that's what they did. And sure enough, the Chinese workers had no choice but to come back to work. And so they lost their strike easily, mainly because of the conditions. Although, even if the conditions had been good, the Big Four probably would have found a way to defeat their strike effort. In 1869, this project had begun in 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, when the bill was passed in Washington, D.C., and Congress signed into law by Lincoln, when both the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific met at Promontory Point, Utah, and the Golden Spike was driven into the ground. Dignitaries from all over the world were there. The President of the United States was there. A lot of big shots were on hand for this momentous event. And the rest of the world was watching this. Europeans, for instance, knew how impressive this was as an engineering feat, as an organizational success. They understood the size of this continent and what it took to put a railroad line all the way across it. And American leaders certainly derived confidence from this as well, and are in a sense saying, we're on the move, and we're moving up, and everybody else better get out of the way. So this was a potent symbol, and it was seen as such, of American upcoming success and wealth and power. Used for good or ill purposes, it was power nonetheless. Bret Harte, a famous writer from this period, like Mark Twain, wrote a poem that said about this. He was actually there at when the Golden Spike was driven. What was it the engine said? Pilots touching head to head, facing on the single track, half a world behind each back. Sort of behind each of these trains, he's saying is a half of a world or half of a continent. He spices it up, embellishes by saying half a world to make it thoroughly poetic. In Frontiers, the author says, no one could doubt the power of the railroad to transform. What miracles would it work for the West? Well, a lot. Come to find out. By the 1880s, there were 4 transcontinental railway lines across the country. This was just the first. There were 3 to follow just in the next a decade or two. Forget the years that those were finished. I mentioned earlier that capitalist enterprise, entrepreneurship was a big business, was a big part of the West. And I'm just going to touch on a few examples of it. We could go into others as well. Profits on the hoof, the rise of the cattle industry. Cattle as a big business. Right? You don't usually think of it that way. Big speculative investment, sort of buying and selling, bonds and herds of cattle. But this was true. It was going on. So when we look at these pictures, when we just sort of think, okay, those are cowboys, and they're doing the things that cowboys do, dealing with herds of cattle. But if that cowboy on the right, the black and white picture, is the owner of the herd, and he's probably not, but if he's the owner of the herd, when he looks out and sees that, he's looking at dollar signs. He's not just looking at animals or what do I have to do to get what do I have to get done right now. He's looking at dollar signs. That's why he's trying to get things done. One author has said large transactions are made. One person involved at the time, said large transactions are made every day in which the buyer does not see a hoof of his purchase, and very likely does not use more than 1/2 of the purchase money in the trade before he has sold and made an enormous margin in the deal. Again, that is to say, one of my main points here is that we don't associate the West that often, even these pictures. Oh, my cowboys. We don't associate that with capitalism. We don't associate that with sort of big business and industry, industrial development. But this guy's saying that the cattle ranching was as big as a capitalist enterprise, and stuff trading on Wall Street just as much in cattle as in anything else. And by the way, Americans were not beef eaters until this period. Until the move sort of to the west into places like Texas and Oklahoma and the plains. Americans ate pork before this. So before this, I'm not saying there was no beef, but it was not widespread like it is now. I think that's a surprise to most people. We're so used to beef, whether it's good for us or not, being a big part of our diet, whether you're a vegetarian or meat eater or not. It's a big part of our diet, even if you don't partake, that we assume that it's kind of always been that way. But it's only been from really the Gilded Age on. And the cattle industry rose quickly, takes off right here before our eyes. One of the things that takes off as part of this were boom towns. There were a number of them. One of the most famous is Abilene, Kansas. And the definition of a boom town is that it rises really quickly in terms of population, success, wealth, and then crashes really quickly back into oblivion again. And why boom towns here? Because the boom town at any one time, there might be more than one, but they would be strategically located where railway lines were. But once there was a railway line that was sort of closer to where cattle ranchers and cowboys could drive their cattle, whichever is more convenient, they're going to go there. So once Abilene wasn't as convenient any longer of a place to send your cattle to put them on train cars to ship them to the East Coast and New York and Pennsylvania, where they're going to sell for lots of profit, then one boom town then sort of drives another one into destruction. Joseph McCoy, one of the first and early successes as a cattle rancher, became wealthy, said no point in the West of 5 times the size of Abilene's resident population did 1/2 the amount of business that was done in Abilene. So a town that was sort of nothing before rose to sort of great heights. Just intense business activity and lots of money changing hands. Lots of cattle coming through and being sent cattle cars to the east before it finally collapsed. I forget what came after it. When the herd is delivered to the purchaser, a day of rejoicing. This is also Joseph McCoy from the time. The cowboy has come, for then he can go have a jolly time. And it's a jolly time they have. Straight away after settling with their employers, the barbershop is visited. And 3 to 6 months' growth of hair is shorn off. Their long grown, sunburnt beard set in due shape and properly blacked. Next, a clothing store is gone through, and the cowboy emerges a new man in outward appearance, everything being new, not excepting the hat and the boots. The bar room, the theater, the gambling room, the body house, the dance house, each and all come in for their full share of attention. Lastly, in any of these places, an affront or a slight, real or imaginary, had is cause sufficient for him to unlimber one or more heavy revolvers, invariably found strapped to his person, and proceed to deal out death in unbroken doses to such as may be in range of his pistols. If there was one place where the kind of romanticized kind of movie version of the West that we talked about as kind of basically myth actually played itself out, it was here in these boom towns in places like Abilene. Young adult males, the cowboys mostly were, with a bit of money in their pockets at the end of the cattle drive here. They get paid and they're tired. They don't want to go back home, at least for a few days. They can make a lot of mischief indeed. Just a accidental bumping of shoulders in a barroom could lead to homicide, and sometimes did. So there was lots of excitement in these towns, not always of a pleasant nature. Another example of business acumen and the takeoff of the economy in the West is what became known as bonanza farming. William Allen White, one of the great journalists of the time, well known in the country, became fascinated with this type of agriculture. It was new. And he said in one passage, he wrote a lot about this, the successful farmer of this generation must be a businessman first and a tiller of the soil afterward. He must be a capitalist, cautious and crafty. He must be an operator of industrial affairs, daring and resourceful. So I'm drilling this home in as many ways as I can, but this is the same theme. Right? We think of the West, cowboys, in this case farmers, as just that. A farmer with overalls, and he's got a little house and a few animals around and chickens, and but he's saying no, these guys are capitalists. At least on these big bonanza farm means big farm, thousands of acres. These are industrial enterprises. These are like corporate enterprises. The American phenomenon was enough to astonish any student of agriculture, H.W. Brand says. It looked more like industry. All aspects of the bonanza farms were huge, from their physical extent to the tools employed in their cultivation. Human muscle power had been replaced by machine power on the big farms. A farm of many thousand acres operated more like a principality, a country, than a farm. The telegraph brought the world to Dakota's door. The bonanza farms exist in California and Idaho and many places in the West, but the Dakotas are kind of the most famous. No arable region was too remote to escape the attention of the managers of bonanza farms. What another century would call globalization reached Dakota in the 1890s. So William Allen White had reason to be impressed by this because this is part of what made America into a giant economic power. Right? Its capacity, partly because of its size, to produce huge amounts of agriculture, but partly because its organizational and technological innovations, which are being attested to here. The Homestead Act, which came in 1862, also during the Civil War, signed into law by President Lincoln after passing both houses of Congress, gave free land to average people out west, 160 acres, if you could live on it for 5 years. More on that in a moment. It created about 1 million new farms. So this was a deliberate attempt by the Lincoln administration to open up settlement to the west. Not that there weren't already settlers going out there, but this added to it, big time. Lincoln was really pushing. The Congress was really pushing for faster and bigger economic development in the West. It made many Westerners more loyal citizens since they got free land from the government. Brands saying the Homestead Act held out the promise that anyone of whatever means, however poor you started, could take part in the American dream of land ownership. Right? If it's free, you don't have to be a rich guy. You don't have to take out a loan. You don't have to have lots of money in the bank. You get it. If you live there for 5 years, okay, so what? Who wouldn't? You're just going to plop down for 5 years. That's nothing. If you're going to get 160 acres out of it, you're already there. Well, look at this house. Can you even see it? Did somebody there's like a big giant anvil like drop on the top of this thing, like in the cartoons. Most of it's of course below, floor or ground level. But these are the kind of houses that they had to live in oftentimes for those 5 years. So, it could be done, and most people, of course, would stick it out, and not everybody lived in such squalor as this guy. But there's quite a few primary source records on this. Howard Rood, a settler in Kansas, said, and this quote is kind of chopped up. I had to kind of mess up the syntax to get everything kind of in one pithy quote here. So it's not totally grammatically correct, only because I chopped it up. It's kind of funny in a way, too. Underclothes, I don't wear. Socks, there are none. I never know what time it is when I get out of bed, because clocks are like angels' visits, few and far between. Most people here don't drink real coffee because it's just too expensive. The people who live in sod houses just have a dirt floor, and you have fleas for sure. They seem to spring from the dust of the earth. And it goes on and on. There are many quotes like this. So it wasn't as easy, apparently, to live there for 5 years as it may sound. Lastly, a lot of people, poor, average people, went west to chase the American dream. As I say, ended up moving from factory to farm, like a homestead that was theirs outright, to being a coal miner. That's the American dream. For some people, or the failure of the American dream. Not everybody who got a homestead or paid for their own land was successful. Sometimes maybe it was their own fault. Sometimes they maybe been on a bad piece of land, bad luck, whatever misfortune might befall them, and they end up losing their land. It's foreclosed on by the bank, and they get a job. And they get a job in a coal mine working for a gigantic corporation. So maybe they worked for a big corporation in New York City in a factory, and now they end up working maybe for that same corporation in places here like Colorado. This was during a strike. Those coal miners were probably, all of them, people who'd come west to achieve the American dream, to have a better life, own a farm, and it didn't work out that way for everyone. I'm not saying nobody, improved their life. Many Americans did, but it wasn't a sure thing.